Welcome to Mission Majjhima. Ajahn.
Ajahn.
So tell us about the Cūḻasaccaka Sutta, Majjhima 35.
So the Cūḻasaccaka Sutta is the account of an encounter between Saccaka, who is a member of the Jain sect founded by Mahavira, which was contemporaneous with the Buddha and often serves as a bit of a foil to the Buddha's teachings. And there's numerous debates between disciples of the two sects within the canon. And the Buddha usually wins because it's the Buddha. So in this case, Saccaka approaches Venerable Assaji and asks what the Buddha teaches. And Venerable Assaji, again, was one of the first arahants that the Buddha taught, one of the first five, and the monk that inspired Venerable Sariputta to go forth. And Venerable Assaji says the Buddha teaches basically that all five aggregates of clinging, form, feeling, perception, sankhara, volitional formations, and consciousness are not self. And Saccaka says this is a displeasing teaching, and he hopes to basically debate the Buddha about it at some point. He then goes to the assembly of Lichavis and invites them all to come see him destroy the Buddha in debate, and he has a great kind of image of how he's going to thrash the Buddha like an elephant in the hemp washing game. And we haven't done that, but it sounds intense. And so they all go. And Saccaka encounters the Buddha. And you see the scene which often occurs where the Lichavis come to the Buddha, and some show a respectful greeting, some simply say their names, some remain silent. And it's this image of the moment when people encounter the Buddha, and some have faith and some don't. It's very realistic. And then the debate begins, and basically Saccaka asks the Buddha, or if he does indeed assert that the aggregates of clinging are not self, and then makes his own assertion, which is because these aggregates of identity serve just as the ground serves as kind of the basis for plant life. Even so, these aggregates serve as the conduit and cause of karma, of merit and demerit, and the continuity of, basically in his view, of being, and therefore they are self. The Buddha counter-questions him then and says, basically beginning by asking if a king exercises control over his kingdom. And Saccaka says he does. And then the Buddha asks him, do you exercise control over these khandhas? Can you tell your body not to grow old, get sick, to change? And Saccaka remains silent and refuses to answer at first, at least. Then the Buddha presses further, and basically using the same phrasing you come across in the Anattalakkhana Sutta, the second of the seminal discourses, the discourse on not self, the second discourse the Buddha gave that basically ushered those first five disciples into arahantship, where he says each of these aggregates is impermanent and suffering, and therefore cannot be considered self. You do not have control over it. And Saccaka is forced to admit this, and in the end goes on to actually counter the question the Buddha in an amicable way, asking what practice the Buddha teaches and what one looks like when they've achieved final gnosis in that practice. And the Buddha talks about how you look at the aggregates of identity in exactly this way until you've abandoned all delight and lust for them, all attachment to them. And Saccaka actually kind of gains a measure of faith, or at least some humility, and asks the Buddha, says he shouldn't have challenged the Buddha. It was like trying to challenge a raging bonfire. And then invites the Buddha and his Sangha to a meal, invites the Lichavis to help provide the meal, and at the very end, basically asks that the goodness of that meal be dedicated to the donors, the Lichavis, sort of implying that he doesn't need it because he still considers himself a saint, and he doesn't take refuge at the end of the sutta. And the Buddha kind of counters him by saying, actually, this merit can be for you because you're not a saint yet. So it's a final kind of little motion of humbling, which the Buddha brings, but there's much to go into in this discourse. It's a long and interesting kind of moment. Ajahn, what would you begin by drawing out here?
Just the main flavor of the sutta. I mean, it's got a lot of humor, honestly. Saccaka is, he's really skilled in dialogue, and he's funny. His metaphors are funny and, I mean, offensive in a certain way, but just to highlight some of those is when you mentioned some of this, but when he's talking about how he's going to defeat the Buddha in debate, he says, even if I were to engage a senseless post in debate, it would shake, shiver, and tremble if it were to engage in debate with me. So, what shall I say of a human being, the Buddha? Just as a strong man might seize a long-haired ram by the hair and drag him to and drag him fro and drag him round about, so he'll do it to the Buddha. Just as a 60-year-old elephant might plunge into a deep pond and enjoy playing the game of hemp washing, as you said, so too he's going to do the hemp washing game with the Buddha. And then later on in the sutta, after the Buddha has, kind of destroyed his arguments and really embarrassed him in front of all of these lichavis, the sutta highlights how Saccaka is just sweating. You know, he's so visibly shaken up and he's just sweating. And then the Buddha actually exposes his upper body and his golden skin, and that he himself is not sweating. So, a good, fun sutta to keep us interested as we go through. I hope we can go into the Vajrapani, the thunderbolt wielding spirit. But maybe turn it over to you, Ajahn. What else would you like to draw up from this sutta?
The ways that both posit or destroy the idea of atta, self. Saccaka basically says, look, because these khandhas, these aggregates, serve as a basis and continuity of kama, of awareness, they must be self. And this comes up a lot. You see this people saying, okay, if there's no self, what carries kama? And in the Buddhist teaching, it's the opposite. Kama serves as the context for the sense of self. One pattern of kama, of this continuity, is the sense of self. Rather than kama being in the context of self, it's self in the context of kama. And so the Buddha, in other suttas gives dependent origination as this modicum of continuity, but it's a radical phenomenology. And basically that paradigm of that Saccaka is putting forth is not, the Buddha gives a whole different way of looking at our experience and how things carry, and there's no self below it. And then just this great analogy of the kingdom, and that basic sense that self has to be something under your control. And it's so intrinsic to the sense of self. I think it almost goes unnoticed that is something we assume about it. But the Buddha pointing that out, and when people aren't sure what anatta means, I think this is a really helpful image of in some ways it can be this simple, do you have control over this? And when you realize that, can you still consider it deeply atta? What else would you bring out, Ajahn?
Just since I brought it up, this thunderbolt wielding spirit, the Pali is Vajrapani. So some people, Vajrapani is a character or a being in the Tibetan pantheon. This is the only instance of that word, that name, that title in the Pali canon, but some Tibetan-nologists will say that, okay, here's a place where the name, the entity, the role appears in the Pali canon, and it appears when Saccaka is trying to prevaricate and is not wanting to respond to the Buddha. And the Buddha says, watch out, Saccaka, if you don't answer me, don't answer a Buddha after he's asked something 3 times, then your head will split. And then both Saccaka and the Buddha see this Vajrapani, this thunderbolt wielding spirit, above the Saccaka's head. So an interesting appearance. Don't really actually know what to make of it. The sutta doesn't go very much into detail on that. And it's worthy of noting that Assaji was one of the 5 disciples, was one of these 5 ascetics who the Buddha was teaching in the Dhammacakka Sutta and a discourse on not self, and was actually the inspiration for Sariputta, the Buddha's disciple foremost in wisdom. Sariputta saw Assaji just going for alms in a very inspiring, composed, just utterly inspiring deportment. And Assaji gives this very short teaching, which points to, as you were doing, the causality of Buddhism, saying whatever there is which has a cause, that cause and its cessation, this is what is taught by the Tathagata, the great Samana. So, all right, Ajahn, so what is the word of the week?
The word of the week is khandha, which means aggregate of clinging, or at least aggregate. And it comes from the root kan, which means to gather.